Good evening, everybody. How's it going? How are you getting on? All right, it's lovely to see you. Oh, shit. I'll tell you what, there's some scene down there in that green room, right? There's a band down there figuring out how to play Introducing by DJ Shadow. Honest to God. I kind of felt bad because I was like, geez, I don't know what to ask Brian Cross. No, what'll I ask him? And then I saw what those lads are sweating down there, figuring out how to play Introducing. Unbelievable stuff. A chordia. Is mór an honor le bheithin seo san téidir taibhearc an áling seo sa grílár cathrach na Galway. Agus mar chuid den bhéle alín. Tá man seo le Brian Cross no B+ don chórá First Thoughts. It's a huge honor for me to be here in the Taibhearc Theatre in this beautiful place and right in the heart of Galway as part of the Galway Arts Festival and as guests of Songs from an Open Road. And I'm here with Brian Cross B+. Brian Cross, B+, is a Limerick man based in Los Angeles. He's been over there for over 30 years now, photographing, filmmaking, teaching, homemaking, hanging out, and very much creating and crafting a unique and fascinating life's work. In the very early 90s, he published his first book, It's Not About a Salary, Rap, Race, and Resistance in Los Angeles. In the very early 90s, he published his first book, It's Not About a Salary, Rap, Race, and Resistance in Los Angeles, which set the tone for what was to follow in his creative and academic career. Cross has served as photo editor of Rap Pages and Wax Poetics, founded a production company, Mochilla, with distinguished photographer Eric Coleman, directed music videos and documentaries, become a professor of photography at UC San Diego, and indeed continued to work as one of the music industry's most highly regarded photographers and filmmakers. He has shot the cover of Underground Legends Freestyle Fellowships, Inner City Griots, to Eazy-E, David Axelrod, Brian Wilson, George Clinton, and Jay Dilla. He even shot the legendary Introducing cover for DJ Shadow, and this is naming just a few. Brian, how are things? You're very welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm good, Ray. I'm good. I'm dealing with the jet lag, but I'm good.
You're still dealing with the jet lag, yeah?
I only got here 2 days ago, so.
Yeah. So that was question one, how are things? Question two is, how is Galway treating you?
Galway's treating me very well, man. I'm happy to be here, man. It's wonderful. I've actually stayed my first night in Galway 2 nights ago, so I would always drive home if I ever came up here, so I actually stayed the night.
Yeah. Limerick man as well, of course. You going watching hurling tomorrow?
Yes.
You want to give us any sporting insights before we get into the music and photography?
I was watching the Camogie before I came out, and it was spectacular. That's all I'll say. Support the ladies as well. The Camogie, fair play to the Camogie, man. I didn't see. Did anyone hear what's the final score with Tip and Waterford? Did anyone see? No one was watching.
No, they get the moral support. They get the moral support, but not the actual eyeballs.
What?
There you go. Thanks, Bill.
Oh, fantastic. First time they're in an All-Ireland final in a long time. Don't remember how many years, but yes, 4 in a row. I said it.
Oh, listen. There we go. And actually, of course, 1973 was a great year.
I was there.
Limerick won an Ireland. Were you at Croke Park that year?
I was. My uncle Brendan brought me. I was 6 or 7 years old. Yeah, and I was there in 2018. And I don't think I was in Croke Park in the middle.
No way.
Yeah.
You're like the Kerry crowd.
No.
You only go there for the glory.
Yeah, I mean, and it was glorious. I will say that. It was glorious, yeah. It was a very, yeah. Come on, man. You know.
All right. So in August 1973,
yes,
Cool Herc was throwing a block party, which is regarded as the birth of hip-hop. And in September 1973, you were attending Limerick.
Only you would find a way to put those two things together. That's spectacular.
It writes itself. It's perfect.
That's true. That's absolutely and utterly true. Yes, 11th of August, 1973. Cool Herc. I don't know. I mean, look, I think the thing to understand about that moment particularly is it's important. Like origin moments are really important. And it's really important to think about what, precisely how things begin. And I think there are a lot of things that we could look at and say that is the origin moment of hip hop. But I think there is something wonderful about the idea of, it's not Carnegie Hall. It's not some fucking, it's a basement of a projects, a public housing, you know what I mean? An estate, in the basement of some building, a bunch of kids, a bunch of teenagers got together and began the most important cultural movement in post-war, I would say the world, But ostensibly what it does really for me, or at least the way that I think about it, is that it's a way that certain practices, rituals, celebratory kind of traditions are brought together in a way. For me, it's very similar to what happens with samba. But you have all these traditions that come together in an urban situation where people are brushing up against each other, and then something new emerges out of it. But it's not like, people have been improvising in rhyme for hundreds, who knows, thousands of years. It's not like rapping began there. It didn't. Rapping existed. It's not like people weren't dancing like that. I mean, everybody's seen the memes online where you see people doing moves that, King Sunny Ade, for example, claims that, breakdancing began in Nigeria. Those kids from the Bronx saw us. But something was named in that moment that would change the world, and it's very important, and it's very important that we're able to talk about it now, 50 years later, and celebrate it.
Yeah, and it has changed the world undoubtedly. But let's say if we look at it in a linear way like that, if we look at it, hip hop being 50 years old, I mean, you would have landed into Los Angeles, 20 years into that, or thereabouts.
Yeah, 27 or something. Yeah.
Like in what ways
years.
have you seen, like you would have seen a lot of changes and a lot of things that changed within hip hop since then. In what way do you think that hip hop has, has it reacted to its own world or evolved in its own way in that 50 years? And were there any points where you thought like you were part of this and where you were witnessing it firsthand when you arrived there in the early 90s?
I mean, I arrived there in the early 90s. I arrived there in 90, but I had been there in 88 on a J1 visa, much to the chagrin of my parents. Dick, see Dick here. Came home with no money but a bunch of records, which was not cool. That's not what you're supposed to do with your J1 visa money. But I'd had an opportunity to kind of see up close. I was when Schoolie D played in '87 and in Dublin. I was there when PE played in '88. I was there. I mean, I was already absolutely, full of the energy of a kind of first generation hip hop fan, basically a fan, somebody who really felt like this was the most important thing happening in the world right now. I think probably with the same kind of energy that cats that were a little bit older than me felt about, let's say, punk rock or that, but hip hop felt bigger somehow. And so when I went back there in 90, I was still, that was the leisure part of my, that's what I did when I wasn't making art. And then when I was making art, I was a landscape photographer. And I was interested in the landscape tradition, coming from here, thinking about that and the sort of political significance of it and what's the role of local kind of knowledge and histories and those kinds of things. And those were the kinds of things that interested me. And then a number of people kind of challenged that barrier that existed in my world between the stuff that I was curious about and interested in and took joy from, and the stuff that I did as a kind of, which I also took joy from, which I was also very interested in, but they were like, nah, you got to crash the walls between those things and you got to go out and you need to become engaged, photograph this. And for me, that was kind of like, well, at first that was just like, I don't even photograph people. Do you know what I mean? Like, how am I supposed to? But I started, and what I noticed quite quickly, and which is what got me the book contract then for It's Not About a Salary, was that there was a whole sort of burgeoning scene in Los Angeles that was basically going unnoticed. Nobody was really paying attention to it in a serious way. And I thought, well, I can help. I can help with this. I can help. I had a feeling about the music I was hearing. I had a feeling about the practices I was witnessing. But then I was like straight off the boat. I mean, do you know what I mean? Obviously it was a plane, but I was straight, I was, do you know what I mean? Like I was like, I don't know.
You were green, I presume.
I was. I still am. At least I like to cultivate the notion of it, And it turned out that, as with meeting DJ Shadow for the first time and being like, wow, this guy is really fucking impressive. He's able to do this with tape deck and a turntable. That's mad. And then turning out that like, actually, yeah, actually I was right. Like there were things, there's echoes, I don't know what it is. Since I was very young, I always had a decent set of ears. I always had a thing with music. I always was able to, like, that song is gonna go. That's a hit. Listening to Radio Luxembourg under the pillow, kind of. Do you know what I mean? Back when we only had one radio station, not to mind. Well, in the west of Ireland, obviously on the east coast it was different, but. And so, yeah, it was like suddenly now my ears became a part of the practice of my eyes or the practice of my brain. And I kind of, there was no lane as well as the other thing, It wasn't a job. I'm happy to say it's still not a job, or at least it never feels like, or if it ever starts to feel like a job, I get a bit nervous or whatever. Teaching is different, but, so I mean, and then as regards the music and the culture, you have to imagine in that moment, even though now, it's been eulogized through cinema, it's been books, and none of that existed. It's not about a salary. It's really, like the third or fourth book about hip hop, period. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not like there was other books you could refer to, in a normal academic kind of, this is what they call like first-hand research, I mean, it was that. Which I didn't know what that was. I was 25 years old. I was like, someone's going to give me money to interview these dudes? Okay. Take photos? Okay.
But can I put to you that you keep saying that, people said to you that you need to do this. But for you to produce what would have been, like you say, the third or fourth book ever published about hip-hop, that must have taken an awful lot of conviction on your part to say, I am going to talk about something that's fiery as well at the time.
Sure.
This is the time of the LA riots when this is published.
Absolutely.
So you're right.
I'm literally right there.
Zeitgeist.
I'm right there, yeah. No, I had rocks thrown at my car.
An incendiary moment.
Yes. I really believed that what I was engaged with was incredibly important, and it was a story that needed to be told. I mean, if you look at It's Not About a Salary, there's an index in the back, or an appendix actually in the back, which talks about police brutality in Los Angeles. And, that was born out of coming home, talking to the lads, trying to explain, like, it's very difficult to imagine the kind of terror that exists in fellas our age when you see a police car. If you've done nothing wrong at all. And there's palpable fear, like our lives are in danger, and you can feel the temperature change in a car. With you're sitting with a bunch of fellas and you're just like, oh, this is, they would say, in those days, they would always say 5-0, and the vibe would completely change. And it's an attempt to kind of explain that. And what I didn't realize at the time is that little gesture, that sort of small gesture of solidarity or whatever, led to this thing called Stolen Lives, which was an attempt which is like phone book thick documenting incidences of police brutality throughout the country where people were murdered. And that's what led to Black Lives Matter, is in response to Stolen Lives. And you don't even think, that you somehow, some little gesture, and I'm not taking any credit whatsoever, I was just, sometimes little pieces of speech actually can really affect, it's the kind of straw that somebody needed to break the, and Yeah, I mean, an attempt to open yourself up and to look properly, objectively, with empathy, and try to understand the situation and try to understand what would allow people to say, fuck the police. I mean, it's actually, there is a radical aspect to it. I mean, there's no other way to think of it, but yeah.
Yeah, there's a courageous aspect as well. And the other thing as well, and we'll probably come back to Black Lives Matter and stuff like that in a while, because I'm interested in how, I suppose, in some ways, like, protest kind of bookends when you went there initially, like in the publication of that book.
For sure.
And then in the last couple of years.
Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of still happening there. And we spoke about like the linear shape of hip hop, if such a thing exists. Like that, yeah, but it certainly bookends your time in the States.
No, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, the interesting thing about it is that I guess I would argue that hip hop itself is an argument against linear histories. Sampling is a much more interesting and sophisticated way of doing history than what conservative historians do, which is that then this follows this, and it's really a history of important men doing important things in badly lit rooms. That's not it. That isn't it. It's never been it. I never thought that was it. I never thought that was it. I think it's much more interesting, actually. It's like a Walter Benjamin idea of it's a kind of ground up. Somewhere in the details, there's something that will illuminate what's radical here, what's interesting, what's really at stake here in the bigger picture. And that's what, that's, for me, that's always been, even since I lived here, actually, that was the kind of work that I was interested in. So,
and it's interesting you said it, because you spoke about landscape photography and how that in doing that, in the art of doing that, you're understanding a kind of a local knowledge.
Yeah.
And it seems like that wherever you've gone, you've always gone to understand the place. So if we think of the music that you have covered in California, be it the rap or DJ Shadow or, Brain Feeder or Low End Theory or anything like that, it's always been of the place.
For sure.
And before you left for the States, tell me about the music of the place that you were experiencing in Limerick.
Wow. What was I listening to? Honestly, I was listening to hip hop in Limerick. I was at NCAD from 84 to 89. And I would say from about 80, I remember having an argument with Des from the Golden Horde in my flat in Dublin, and saying, and we had this cassette, and on one side of the cassette was Run DMC's first album, and on the other side of the cassette was Jesus and the Mary Chain. And it was this kind of argument where we were like, it was like, no, Des, did Run DMC, that's the future, Des. You can imagine, with drink taken. It was tremendously unpleasant. But no, Des is a wonderful guy, a great guy. Yeah. But it is with that kind of seriousness that we thought, it did feel profoundly new. It did feel like, and I didn't even, I was far less sophisticated in those days in my way of understanding, but you could feel it. There was something you could feel in the sort of breaking out of the sort of, traditional pop song structure, the traditional way, the notion of singing, the notion of speech versus singing, the notion of, not traditional hooks, not, like all this kind of stuff, new technology, new kind of interface, new way of dealing with older music, all seemed very vital and important and significant. And mostly that's what I was listening to. As far as I mean, there's music that I go back to from that time that I still feel fondly about, like the Pogues, like Prefab Sprout. You know what I mean? Like there's still room for me to remember that. But mostly I think what was driving me at that time was I was already listening to hip hop. Yeah.
All right. And I heard you say before that that you first got into Motown records and stuff like that when you were listening to probably pirate radio in Limerick.
Yeah, Big L. Who remembers Big L in Limerick? Damn.
Nobody admitting it.
Crickets.
A cryptic whistle.
Those of us old enough don't remember. Yeah. Anyways, yeah, no, Big L. I remember calling Big L and being like, I wanted to go in there and listen to Motown music. I mean, it was difficult to hear that kind of music. You know, it was like Brendan Balfe would play music on RTE1, and there was no RTE2 yet. Do you know what I mean? And it's not like even RTE2 when it did come was that suddenly like the fucking curtains blew open and it was that fucking great. You know what I mean? It was like, but and you couldn't get BBC Radio 1. Like it wasn't like you really could. During the wintertime, sometimes you could get it, but the radio is still. I mean, I would say like my Irishness, whatever that means, is absolutely inscribed. I mean, I've become more Irish again because of the app on my iPhone and the fact that I can listen to the morning news as I go to sleep in California, and I'm able to stay for better or worse. Worse, did I say? Connected to what's going on. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, radio has always had an important part to play, funnily enough. So, yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah. And I suppose, I heard you say that before about that understanding American politics is easier from an Irish perspective on Irish radio.
Fuck. Yeah, actually, it's okay. Yeah, there's an aspect of it that is. I mean. During the, how should I describe them? There's been several difficult periods, but
it's not like Voldemort or something. He who can't be named or something.
No. I don't want to name it after the normal way that it would be named. But the period after 2016, the bad hair era, the orange era. Yeah, I mean, to listen to NPR or whatever would give you anxiety, man. And somehow the distance of listening to, drive time, explaining yet another debacle in American politics was a little bit more. It was easier to deal with than listening to NPR explain it, or you know what I mean, like or watching it on CNN or God forbid any of the other channels, So so there's a kind of the payoff really is that. It's a kind of weird triangulation that's happening or whatever.
Yeah.
But Anyways, yeah.
But anyway, look, we'll park all that and talk about the music. Actually, like, isn't it weird that, the two of us are up here, we're up on a stage, we're on a musical stage that is set with musical instruments, and yet neither of us are musicians.
Yeah.
I mean, what's all that about? How would we convey to this lovely audience here that we are not a couple of charlatans absolutely stealing a living?
I think it's useful for this audience to understand that we probably are a couple of fucking charlatans. As if anybody who was sitting up here, please deal with them with the same respect enough to know we could be talking out of our arse. But
always a possibility.
Always a possibility. Always. So that level of self-criticality is very helpful, and I think it's so
good stuff. Just to clear the air, I suppose. So listen, something I want to ask you about is I think there's a beautiful pattern that you see in your work is that you've very often photographed communities. So if we look at the time of It's Not About a Salary, it would have been a community of rappers coming together, or a community of musicians coming together. We would have seen the same at the time I mentioned already, Low End Theory, Brain Feeder, and stuff like that. The DJs like Cut Chemist and DJ Shadow, J-Rock, how these lads come together to make music. And here in Galway, there is a thing called the Community Scratch Games. I don't know how you're aware of that.
I'm aware of it. I've never seen it or anything, but I have somebody that I've been told about it.
It's an annual festival that takes place in the beer house over the river, and it's again a collection of scratch DJs, very niche art form, and every year it's the most explosive little party that takes place on Easter weekend. But what it is, it just really fires up just a small amount of people. The crowd are just hype beyond belief, and then the artists get together once a year, and in this niche art form, look at each other and what each other is doing. They fire up, and then they come back next year trying to impress the person from last year.
Yeah.
And it's just an amazing thing to be part of. And so in your experience, So tell us about those kind of things. The likes of like the DJ collectives, the likes of the rap collectives, or even the beats collectives, like in Low End Theory. How important is that sense of community in?
I mean, that's it. I mean, that's really it. I mean, what I would say is like, look, the way I've tried to explain this to people, and I've had people come and visit from here and go to say Low End Theory and be like, Jesus, like this. I mean, it's not that different than Costello's in Limerick, which, you know what I mean? Like, if you're from Limerick, you know what I'm saying? You know what I mean? Your shoes stick to the carpet on the way in. Do you know what I mean?
Best place in the world. I love it, man.
But what I'm saying is, no, I mean, if it's a luxury hotel you're looking for, that's not the right place. You know what I mean? Like, but it feels lived in. Number one. Number two, it happens consistently. Number three, if you can keep it going for more than 5 years, you've already changed something. You've already done something from nothing. You've already created something from nothing. A community of people that are now friends, that are now sharing information, that are now sharing technologies, that are now sharing spaces every week, that get to know each other. Things happen. Things happen. Things happen that are now associated with this event, this ritual that you've opened up a space for. That's culture. What's Homegirl selling tickets for the, Coldplay playing next year at the fucking Crow Park is not culture. That's commerce. I mean, you know what I mean? Like, like I don't give a shit. You know what I mean? It's like, I'm nothing against Coldplay, and if you like Coldplay, great. But that's not what I mean. That's not what culture is ultimately. What culture is people coming together in those kinds of ways, people organizing around common interests, common concerns, common even spiritual, interests often is what, those kinds of rituals is what drives this. And opening up autonomous spaces, like spaces that you didn't get permission for. Like, this is really important. Like, the notion that, like, somehow, like, we decide we're going to get all our friends together and we're going to do something, and we're not going to get permission to do it. We're just going to do it. Is a kind of expression of a kind of autonomous way of being. And when you go to places like the south of Mexico, where people have risen up against the state and are all en masse, considered heretical and, dissident. I mean, it's the same thing. It's the same thing as people thinking in a people-conscious way. You know what I'm saying? And this is we're back to politics now, maybe, but...
This is where you can dip back,
But, for me, this is what's important. I mean, this is what's important about this kinds of thinking. It's what's important about this culture. This culture is, you have to understand, like I did say, it's from a state. It's from people that had nothing. It's from people that were forgotten, that nobody gave a shit about. Who lived in, crime-ravaged, poverty-ravaged neighborhoods that decided that it was more interesting, it was more productive to gather together around records and dancing than it was to, indulge in things that would, put them in jail or put them in the grave. And that's, that's it. That's what culture is. Do you know what I mean? That's what we're celebrating here. You know what I mean? 50 years later. So, yeah.
And in that sense, can you explain to me what has happened culturally in terms of Limerick music in the last 10, 15 years?
How much time do you have?
Just give me the highlights.
I don't know I'm the right person to give you the highlights, honestly.
Or even your impression of it, yeah.
I'm happy to speak to it a little bit. I mean, I think there's more qualified people than me here in the room to speak to this, but I'm the one with the mic in front of me, so just let me honor those who are here, who are, please, if I say this wrong, correct me. But there's a number of things coming together, obviously. I think culturally, Limerick is a very interesting place. I think for a lot of people in this country, that's kind of a shock, which is fucking weird, but they think of us in other ways. At a certain point in time, some resources were put into play that didn't exist. You know what I'm saying? Like music generation, primarily, is what I'm talking about. And much like The Good Life in South Central Los Angeles, that opened up a kind of space for a bunch of people with ideas, with thoughts, with ambition to bring something to the table. And it's one of those things that, if you look at places like, if you look at The Good Life, let's say in Los Angeles, which was basically it was like a health food cafe when I first was shooting back there in the early 90s. And there was this event that used to happen there every Thursday night where they would have like an open mic, and it became like a place for young MCs or aspiring MCs to gather. Nobody really had a clue, like the first African-American woman to be nominated for an Oscar for directing was one of the MCs. Do you know what I mean? There's all kinds of actors, dancers, but because that little space was there for people to rap, everybody thought, I'm going to try and rap. And I think Limerick, in some respects, is also this. It's like, here's a little space for people to be heard and get some attention, maybe even get a little bit of money, a little bit of, and that's been a part of it. The larger thing around that is that I think we have a tendency to look at places where people are living in difficulty as problems. And I think that's often a mistake. I think those places should be looked at as places for opportunity. Those are places where opportunities need to be brought to people, need to be made available to people. I think that's the key. And I think Limerick is a good example of this, like when the narrative looks like, it's this, I'm not even going to repeat, you know what I mean? But it's like this difficult, this knuckle in the middle of Munster, basically, that is problematic. Hey, how long did it take that narrative to get flipped? And I mean, of course, it's everything. I mean, there's all kinds of, but resources is the key, man. Resources is the key. And if you believe we don't have resources, you're buying into the wrong narrative. When it comes to all kinds of stupid things, we don't need to say, there's resources. And it's this, everything tells us this. I don't believe it. I do believe we have enough money to look after ourselves in terms of health, in terms of education, and in terms of housing. I refuse to believe that this country isn't capable of that. It's a joke. What is wrong with us, man? You know what I mean? So, anyways.
Yeah. But we're here talking about hip hop being 50.
Yeah.
And we're talking about Limerick there. But what is it about? Like, there's something about rap. Like, I've been in a very privileged position where I've worked in a regional radio station, Spin Southwest down there.
Yeah.
And, like, my job was Irish language radio and Irish music radio, all in one. These are my two favorite things. I was very happy. And in that, my time broadcasting there, you had this incredibly vibrant, like vibrant is a bit of an overused word, but it was genuinely an explosive element to the music. It was just incredible. There's a fella in the house now tonight, I don't know if he's upstairs or downstairs, Deviant Naive Ted, Andy Connolly, who brought through these kids, and like that was just part
And he's
of
an
it.
instrumental figure, man. I mean, that's a very important person.
An instrumental figure, absolutely. And then you had Russ and Gano arriving on the scene, you had the likes of Post-Punk Podge, you had Blind Boy and the Rubber Bandits.
Blind Boy.
Yeah, exactly. Like, this thing is a shot
But
out
look,
of nowhere. Like,
Blind Boy exists in a lane that didn't exist. There is no... Well, how do you write a script for that? There's no advisor in secondary school that, I'll tell you now.
Do you know what's missing?
Do you know what's missing? If you put a plastic bag on your head now.
Who's the artistic director here?
You know what I'm saying? But like, what's that? And even, the other lad, I mean, I don't know if you've seen his videos, the other lad from Rubber Bandits.
Oh, Mr. Chrome, yeah, sure, listen.
His videos are incredible. The quality of storytelling is incredible. And this is, there's something in the water, It's like
there is.
Detroit. It's like Detroit.
And there's an intensity as well. Like, there's a guy, Post-Punk Podge and the Techno Hippies. I don't know if you're familiar with this man, who just plays these live shows, and he's got a fiddle, he's got an envelope over his head, and he's half naked, and this man is just like, you just want to wipe him, and like it's just the most outrageous stuff, and it's just nail you back against the wall, and he sings about his life, but his life, he's also singing about your life. Do you know what I mean? He's just, it's incredible, but it's in this melting pot of Limerick at the moment, and and I think the musicians are feeding off each other in such an amazing, powerful way.
For sure.
That it's an incredible time. But rap is such a massive part of that.
Yeah. Rap is important, man. I mean, it's you know what I mean? Like, there's no getting around it. Like, once the door was open, then suddenly it was like, oh, snap. And like, funnily enough, when I was working on It's Not About a Salary, that was kind of one of the things that I imagined was like, this is going to get very interesting once, what's going to happen when kids in Limerick, Lagos, Luanda, get their hands on this. And yeah, it's amazing, it's amazing. I'm sort of, for me, it's interesting because I feel like I'm an observer, a guest. Like, I feel like I'm a guest on this stage. The real people are going to show up in a minute and play introducing. You know what I mean? And that's how I feel in relation to the culture often. At a certain point in the keeping time moment is where I first started to think, like, actually, in real terms, you could make a contribution to this in a significant way besides just documenting. You could actually suggest things. You actually do have an opinion. You are engaged. You have ears. You are engaged with music. You have ideas all the time. Share them. Be the gift of Herc and Bam and Flash and all of them was, and I mean, this is one of the things about hip hop that is a little bit different, let's say, than some of the other cultural movements, is that it absolutely requires involvement. You know what I mean? It's not like simply enough to go and pay the ticket and go to the Crow Park and wave the funny light and go home. You know what I mean? Like, you
leave Coldplay alone. Man.
All right. Could be worse. But and I felt compelled. I mean, I'm of that generation. I felt compelled that there is a way for me to significantly contribute here, and I should figure out what it is, because otherwise I am operating in a kind of parasitical way in relation to this culture, and I shouldn't be. I shouldn't be. That was never the plan. It's never been the plan to have a footprint that was, out of scale with the kind of people I work with, to show up with the big van and the big dressing rooms and the champagne and all the bullshit. No. That's never, I was never interested in that. I would never, you know what I mean? I can do production, I can do lots of lights if needed or whatever, but I'm not, that kind of big footprint entertainment kind of stuff that's not what it's about. This is a different kind of cultural activity. It's a different kind of cultural work. And I was always more interested in that somehow than, and it bothers me, to be honest, but I was always more interested in that than I was in the notion of being an artist. A museum gallery artist. That was never really something that I felt entirely comfortable with. It was nothing that I felt like, engaged to the level where I need to figure out how to. I was always more interested in how that guy is interesting. How do I get to sit down and build with that guy or that woman,
And this is one of the reasons why I'm extremely excited that you're here this evening on this stage, right? Because I heard you describe one of your ideas originally as a wacky idea, right? Now, that idea you were speaking about at the time was Keep in Time.
Yeah.
Now, can you explain to the people here what Keep in Time, talking drums and whispering vinyl was?
So basically, at a particular time in hip hop, really sort of mid-90s, the kind of holy grail. So, in that era, mostly the music is made by sampling, and a kind of significant, or the root of the sampling is generally drums and drum patterns. And, it gets to the point where people start to fetishize certain drummers. Oh, it has James Gadsden on it. Oh, it has Idris Muhammad on it. Oh, it has Zigaboo Modalist on it, or Clyde Stubblefield, or, you know what I'm saying, Paul Humphrey, or, and Tony Allen. I could go on. And we start to, we're collecting records and we're looking at who plays drums. And what was interesting to me was I had a conversation with a friend, and he said, Earl Palmer was one of these drummers. He played on all the David Axelrod records, which at that time were the really difficult, and everybody wanted records because of introducing and a number of other records. Earl Palmer plays every Tuesday night in Burbank in this little bar. And I was like, how is that possible? Like, that somehow in Burbank on a Tuesday night, the guy who made the records that everybody's looking for is playing for like 50 old timers. You know what I'm saying? And he has no idea that over in this other part of the city, there's all these youngsters going berserk, paying crazy money for records that he was on, and he's right there. And it's one of those sort of classic, it's one of the great conceits of popular culture, really, is that there's this huge gap that exists generationally. I mean, that's just not true. This is like marketing. This is like demographics. Don't believe that nonsense, man. Don't let the algorithm dictate anything to you. Surprise yourself. Listen to things that you absolutely think you won't like. Go listen to them. Listen to them. Like, explore. Don't, stop. MTV is this, over 25. Can't sell them nothing. You know what I'm saying? Like, no, stop. So I went and Earl was the first one. I went to the bar in Burbank, and I sent Earl a drink. And I mean, this is the guy who kind of invented rock and roll drumming. He played on all the early Little Richard sessions. He played on all the Bo Diddley sessions in New Orleans, in Cosmo Matata's studio, which became the sound. And his drums were the sound of early rock and roll. And I sent him a drink, and he comes over like, the waitress said, one of you guys bought me a drink? And I was like, yeah, I bought you a drink. And he was like, thanks. And I was like, nah, man, you Earl Palmer, man, And, the first time I met him, I asked him if he would be in the video for Midnight in a Perfect World. And so that was the first time we did something to him. And when he was in this music video with us, he showed up with like 3 suits. He had like amazing stories. We were paying him like $100. I'm like, dude, we're paying this guy $100. He showed up with 3 suits. Like, like, who does that? And sat down anyway. We had a chat with him. And I thought, like, these stories matched with his beats would be something really, something really significant. Of course, I wasn't even making films at that point. I was making photos. I just thought, like, well, I'll photograph him, I'll interview him, I'll put the interview next to the photo, and then whoop-de-whoop, we'll play him the records, and he'll tell us some stories about the records, and keep it moving, and put it in a magazine, and somebody will see it, and whatever. And basically, when we got close to doing it, it's right around the time of the internet began, which is a turn of the century time. Somebody said, well, why don't you film it? We could put it on the internet. And I thought, okay, we'll film it. And we filmed it. It was 3 drummers, and then J-Rock, Cut Chemist, and Babu beat juggled for them. They'd never seen beat juggling before, which is where you take, 2 copies of the same record and you manipulate them, which you'll see Andy doing very well lately, and which is much more interesting than hearing me talk about it. But we did it for them. They were absolutely shocked at the idea that, like, they were like, well, where do people listen to this? And I was like, well, in nightclubs all over the city. And they were just like completely like overwhelmed. We filmed them being overwhelmed, which in and of itself became a moment. Recorded the audio. Paul Humphrey and James Gadsden ended up playing with some of the DJs, and we made this little short called Keepin' Time. And yeah, it ended up getting into Sundance, and it ended up doing the film festival circuit, and then became a live show Then we took it to Brazil, and there's a bunch of drummers in Brazil. You know how that goes. Love Brazil, of course. And actually, Brazil was the perfect home for it, actually, because Brazil is really the place in the Americas that has, ensemble drumming. Why do you, one drummer, two drummer? Come on, dude. We can have 1,000 drummers, go to samba school. Yeah. Bucket list. If you love this music, find your way to Brazil, go to samba school. Absolutely life transforming, super important experience. I'm saying that as somebody whose life was changed in a significant way. But that's keeping time. That's what happened. I mean, I think, that's really where I start to think, like, is there a way for these wacky ideas to somehow expand, deepen the kinds of conversations that I'm involved in ways where it's not like make the demo, make the record, make the video, keep it moving, tour, da da da. Like, what are the things that are missing? Like, what are we really missing here? What are the conversations that we should be having? And the intergenerational one has always been important for me because I always felt like, and I think it's something significant actually in terms of the real differences between samba and hip hop, is that samba as a culture, coming from the kind of spiritual roots that it comes from, there's always been room for the elders within the school. They have their own aisle, they call it the Isle of the Baianas, but it's the notion, it's in honor of the notion that the space, when samba began, it was in the eyes of the state an illegal activity. It was the Reconstruction period in Brazil. The notion of, Africans gathering in this way to make music was still considered dangerous and illicit. And the spaces that the terreiro is opened up. There's an extraordinary woman called Tia Ciata, opens up her terreiro, or her spiritual space, and samba is born there. And as a result, the elders are kept as part of the culture. So when you see Brazil in time, you see Wilson Das Neves, the great drummer, explaining, let them be as naked as they want, so long as the baianas are there. And I think hip-hop is missing this a little bit. I mean, I think a lot of the sort of social problems of hip-hop wouldn't exist in the same way if the elders were kept close. Yeah. And I think that's something to consider.
And it's interesting as well, like it's another autonomous space.
No, completely. Completely. No, I mean, this is it. I mean, I really think this is important. I mean, I think in those kinds of places where working people, come together in ways where there's no agenda, nothing's being sold, nothing's being pushed on you, nothing's, it's just an open space for the sharing of ideas. This is humanity, this is culture, dude. This is the important stuff. Yeah. And I think we're not so good at reproducing it in official ways, but I think to just encourage people to even open up spaces for people to do the kinds of things that people want to do is a significant step. Yeah. And obviously, yeah. So
powerful stuff. That's brilliant. Now, and I must say, thank you for describing Keeping Time, because about a couple of years ago, and I think I emailed you about it at the time, before I knew you, I was in the pub in Cork, and Dan Walsh told me that, he said, oh yeah, the reason I'm a drummer is because of introducing. I heard it when I was watching skateboard videos when I was a kid. And I was thinking to myself, I thought immediately of Keeping Time. And I thought, I remember when B+ put the DJs with the drummers, and now the jazz drummer is learning from the
samples.
DJ.
No, for sure.
This is the flip again, and it's a generation
on.
Yeah. But indulge us now and tell us about introducing and DJ Shadow. Like, I mean, this is probably your most talked about work, I suppose, is it?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, it was. I knew Josh a long time, even before the record, before all the hype and everything. And he was very, very, very. He's the type of person where he's like, everything is planned and orchestrated and scripted, and he had a stick figure drawing of exactly what he wanted for the cover, which sometimes
really,
yeah. And And we went there and then we did it. That was the first thing we did. Obviously, was we did what he wanted. And then, then there's a little space and it's like, well, what if we, and I've always been I'm always in perspective is interesting to me, and to me, I felt like the way he had drawn it, shooting across the record shelves, was kind of flat. And I wasn't feeling it, and it didn't give you a sense of just how ridiculously big that record store was. And so I thought, well, what if we shoot down through the shelves, And he was like, "Oh, okay, we'll give it a go." And then the cat was blind, and so the cat moves in. And so for me, that was always like a cue.
Was the cat in Shadow's original sketch?
No. And I mean, you can't. You don't allow for accidents when you know what I mean. Like if you say, "Did you get a storyboard?" Of course, we have a storyboard, but like unless there's room for the cat, you know what I mean. You're not making a film. Then you're doing an illustration. You know what I mean? Like it's like you have to allow accidents. And Josh is a great man for that. He's really somebody who really. I mean, Sun Ra has. I've definitely learned a lot from Sun Ra thinking about accidents, but Shadow is a great man for that as well. He's we're always thinking about these sort of like what you want to have happen, but what's even better is when something accidental, And so this blind cat gets in the photo, and it was a few minutes. To be honest with you, I was working on the Raz Kaz record at the same time, and I thought the Raz Kaz record was going to be the West Coast Illmatic, which it wasn't in the end, just for different reasons. I mean, in some respects it was. From a demo perspective, it was. It's an extraordinarily strong record, lyrically. And I thought the Shadow record was just like, oh, that's just, it's going to come out and nobody's going to pay attention to it. It'll be like a niche thing and da-da-da, whoop-de-whoop. And, well, I was wrong. Yeah, so then it's funny, I mean, and I'd be remiss to say, like, that I haven't had, and my family's here now, so they'll definitely can attest to this, but it hasn't been some fucking amazing downhill fucking journey like, yippee, I can't believe it, I'm getting paid to do this. There's been plenty of quiet, hungry moments in the middle, and I remember after the DJ Shadow thing, I was invited by a friend to a dinner with a bunch of art directors. She was like, no, you should meet them. It'll be good for you. And you can explain how your work, and hopefully you'll start to get more work and da-da-da. And I'm sitting there, and this woman sitting opposite me who I've just met is explaining to her friend how annoyed she is that they've flown some photographer from England out here because the band that she's working with, they just want the record to look like the DJ Shadow record. And so we've flown this woman out from England, and she's fucking terrible, and she's a pain in everybody's ass. And then my friend's like, well, the person who shot the DJ Shadow record is sitting right there. And I mean, the way to understand something like that, which I think is important, is that I'm not doing my job properly. Like, if that woman doesn't know that I'm the person that did the DJ Shadow record, that's my fault. That's not her fault. That's my fault. At least that's the way I had to, you know what I mean? Like, yeah, of course, I would much rather she was better at doing her research. But ultimately, you know what I'm saying? Like, yo, let people know when you do things, And so, I mean, it's a kind of a crazy, it's been a crazy sort of record too. And then we recreated it in the video, which was wild. Like we recreated the photograph in the video, and the cat cooperated, and like it's too good, And it's the gift that keeps giving, It's like it's never possible for me to do one of these types of things without somebody saying like, tell the story of. Yeah. But it's just it's one of those significant. I mean, I think the big lesson for me from doing that record, I have to be honest, is that I spent a lot of time prior to introducing, thinking about, this would be better if, it would, like that record, that photograph would have been so much better if I would have brought the other light. If I would have just brought the other light. If we would have got here an hour earlier. If the dude wouldn't have spent so much time getting his hair done, you know what I'm saying? Like none of that happened in introducing. What was interesting in introducing was I went there and I was like, damn, this place is full of fluorescent light. God, fluorescent light sucks. But that's okay because record stores have fluorescent lights. And then it was, how did you get it to be so green? Well, it's like, have you looked at fluorescent lights lately? It's like, there was no trick. That was the color. I mean, that's how it actually looks on film, you know?
Yeah.
And people are like, you know, so anyways.
And the legacy of that album musically, then, like it's an incredibly powerful album that I'm only realizing now ourselves. So when we put this project together, we're playing Fixity, are a band, well, kind of a jazz collective based in Cork that are going to be reproducing, introducing, if you know what I mean, live this evening. But when I speak to musicians about it, like, I mean, Deviant and Naive Ted, Andy Connolly's going to be up here. Like, I mean, is an incredibly difficult guy to get to play a gig. He nearly fucking jumped at me. We were having dinner, and he just goes, "I'm going to put some cuts on it." You know, I said there was another guy, Spud Murphy, a brilliant producer. He's Lancome's producer and stuff like that. He's up in Dublin and very much sought after guy at the moment. He's doing a lot of stuff with Rough Trade Records. He just said, like, "Can I please jump on it? Can I put a moog on it? You know what I mean? Can I put a synth on it?" There's a filmmaker, a guy Julian Hills up in Dublin, said, "Please, can I shoot it if we're doing it again?" So it just still has this kind of magnetic, it has this elevated part. And even like when I was pitching it to RT, I said, like, anybody who cares about independent music in the 90s, anybody who cares about dance music in the 90s, anybody who cares about hip hop will revere this record. So yeah, it has a really interesting place, I think, in musical history.
Yeah, it totally does. I mean, it's a sort of extraordinary record. I mean, I mean, I think in that moment in hip hop is a really, it's kind of high water moment. And for me, what's kind of defines that moment and what Shadow is very much a part of is it's an attempt somehow for musicians to describe kind of new emotional palettes. And so that record for me is very much about a kind of melancholy, loneliness, rural Northern California, Davis, you know, like a agricultural center, which I don't know if necessarily you would imagine introducing as an agricultural record, but that's, you know, I mean, that's UC Davis is the center of, you know, agricultural education in California, for example. And it's a record about that. It's a record about one guy over and over again thinking about how to bend this culture which he's inheriting in a way to speak to a certain kind of feeling. And, you know, honestly, you know, what made Biggie Smalls more compelling and interesting than all of his peers is precisely, or Jay Dilla for that matter, is precisely the same thing, which is that he's able to open up a kind of emotional palette in a way that you wouldn't imagine. You know, Biggie Smalls talking about the notion of, you know, the self, constructing the self in a different kind of way, the vulnerable self, the self at the edge of you know, self-annihilation, so, you know, at the facing death, in ways that in ways that complicate narratives around masculinity, for example. And unfortunately, you know, we don't, you know, this sort of, because of the fact that pop culture is often relegated to this sort of slightly less than serious place, we forget. But the kinds of things that Shadow or Big or Tupac or Dilla or Georgianne Muldrow or Denise Chila do are they complicate notions of the way we relate emotionally to the world around us, and they allow us vocabulary, and they allow us, you know, possibilities for thinking about things in new kinds of ways. And this is really, really important. It serves a very, very important function in our culture. But of course, we just think of it as like, oh, that's just pop music, or that's just, you know, that's just music. That's just what you listen to. But it's like, it's a lot of times how people deal with themselves, you know. I mean, if you're having a difficult moment, there are those songs that you return to. If you are feeling lonely, there are those pieces of music that you return to. If you're finding something difficult or challenging, there are those, or you're working out, and you're reaching that end of your breath. And there's that song that give you the extra little bit of breath. And that's really important. But we don't, it's somehow less important than other things that are.
Brian Cross, B+, everybody. Absolutely brilliant.